Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Beginnings, the show that asks, where do creative people come from? My name is Andy. I'm the host of the show and a writer and performer based in Los Angeles, California. How are you feeling? Are you feeling the insomnia? You feeling the anxiety? Much like I am and Naomi, it permeates our house. Hopefully it is over on Tuesday, but I don't know. I usually don't advertise too much couples therapy stuff on this podcast, but Couples Therapy, the other podcast I do with Naomi, if you are feeling anxiety, we are doing a special live show that day as part of Liz Winstead's Vote No Joke. Basically, it's 12 hours of programming to keep you distracted during the day, and we're doing a fun show at 1 p.m. PST, 4 p.m. EST. And if you go to aafront.org/VNJ, as in Vote No Joke, you can get all the information there, and it's free. So if you are feeling really on edge, you know, it's a whole day of comedy. You should check it out. Also, we're doing a special couples therapy episode that day where we called it the Good Vibes Only edition, and it's us and our friends Aparna Nancherla and Joe Firestone, who you may know from the world of comedy. You may know from being guests on this show. So that'll be fun. But yeah, I'm just trying to survive until the election, and then we'll see. And we'll see what happens emotionally. I'll say this though. There are some incredible episodes of Beginnings coming up, including the one you are listening to right now, because today I talked to Thurston more, and this is just an absolute delight. Thurston is a lovely person. We talk. I called. He lives in London now, and so I called morning LA time, evening London time, and obviously politics is on our minds. I don't know why. For some reason, it's on our minds. But specifically, I think one of the things I was really interested in was Sonic Youth and I'd say Fugazi. Probably those are the two big ones. Were like the first entrees into progressive politics for me. Or they primed me to be, well, now a socialist, now in DSA. And I was kind of curious about what was that for Thurston. And so we end up talking a lot about youth culture in the 60s and 70s. You know, he grows up in kind of like, for real, in the Nixon era. And how did that form him as a person? We talk a little bit about his parents, his dad, and the kind of atmosphere in his household. I don't know. I'm just a huge fan of Thurston's music. His new album is so good. By the Fire. I know he says later in this very episode that Bandcamp is not a like super lucrative financial stream, but you know, go buy his album over there. I do really love Bandcamp a lot. Or hey, buy it wherever. Just buy it. By the way, if this is your first time listening to Beginnings, thank you so much for checking out the show. If you want to check out other episodes, the last 100 are on whatever your podcast app is. They should all be up on Spotify or at Libsyn. That is beginnings.libsyn.com. But, you know what? I've done this show for 10 years. Maybe I just suggest a couple episodes. You know, you're here because Thurston's a musician. I've done episodes with Carl Newman, Kurt Heasley of the Lilies, David Grubbs, Mitski, Tim Kinsella. Oh my God, who else? Sadie Dupuis of Speedy Ortiz, Colin Newman from Wire, Dean Wareham, Mac McCon, Sam Prekop, Owen Pallett, tons of others, tons of comedians and TV writers and film makers and performers, artists, thinkers. So check out those episodes. If you like what you hear and you want to subscribe to the show, you can do that on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon, pretty much any big tech company that is harming us at the moment also has a podcast platform, and you can find beginnings there. I got a lot of awesome interviews coming up, including Ian Mackay, Cy Spurrier, the comic writer, one of my favorite comics writers, Tobin Sprout from Guided by Voices. I just talked to him. Bob Nastanovich from Pavement. That's very interesting. A lot of other cool people, so stick around. Bobby Previtt, I just talked to him today, and might be one of my favorites. So stay tuned for those. But for now, let's talk to Thurston, and also vote on Tuesday, okay? I don't know if you've escaped it. I know England is somewhat similar in political temperament to the U.S. at the moment, but I don't know if you've escaped like the complete irrationality that's taken hold here, where like we're not me, but like a lot of people are trying to pretend like we are existing before the pandemic.
Oh yeah. There's a bit of a feeling of that here where ignore it and it will go away. Let's just sort of like hang out at the pub and take our masks off and have some beers. And it's getting better, isn't it? And in a way, it isn't. It sort of fluctuates. And then there's sort of just been a recent, in the last couple of days, notice from the conservative government here is that we need to get a little more conscientious than we have been for the last few weeks and start wearing masks or you will be fined. We're going to close down these establishments that go past 10 o'clock. 10 o'clock is it. It's done. Everybody go home and stop, socializing. I think I think people realize there's a serious situation. I think a lot of the death toll is rather hidden, and it seems like it's sort of hidden by the media a bit. And it's just like I think if the populace was a bit more witness to the hell that is going on in hospital wards, there would be a bit of more of a system of belief in the horror. And for some reason, I think that's where a lot of these anti-maskers, especially what I see in the USA from afar, anti-maskers sort of invading targets and just sort of like stomping their feet and saying like, stop telling us how to live, because they don't see it. And in a way, it's like you need to sort of see the reality, so you can actually believe it. And as opposed to like, how can we believe what's coming from the current administration when it's been such a litany of lying, right? And when I say lying, I just like it's like almost every single comment has been disproven of its truth. That is, I think, where a lot of the problem is. And so it's just like this great disturbance of misinformation.
It's been, I was thinking about this earlier today. It's like on one side of it, there was this kind of like concerted effort, like after Barry Goldwater, for like the GOP was like, oh, we're going to keep losing elections, so we have to somehow distort reality. And on that's there's been like a 40-50 year campaign to distort reality on that side. And then on like the left-ish side, or like there was all this like culture jamming going on. And yes. I think about like how these two threads, I don't have a good theory or any kind of like real understanding of it, but I've been thinking about how those two threads is kind of like on the like art pranks and kind of stuff, the kind of like artists in the like 70s into the 80s that were kind of playing with reality. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, in some way, those two threads have created these this weird world, because like when
this
you
mass
said the target
meltdown, mass meltdown of like irreality.
yeah, because like the target people, when you were saying that, I was like, I wonder if if that was like a real thing, or if that was like a astroturf
theater, yeah,
like the Koch brothers or the Koch brother, or like the Mercers, or like one of those people like paid these guys to go in there and do it. And how like the right has taken some of these like art tactics, the things that people were using, like Guy Debord or whatever, like that, using to like undermine the right, if they've taken those kinds of tactics over. And I don't know, like it's just like it seems like all those pieces are there, and I'm curious.
I don't know if that creative impulse has the measure of sophistication for people like that. I think, but I think it's interesting. I do think a lot of it has to do with this kind of necessity and desire for power. I mean,
yeah.
So I always sort of saw people who had more sort of social progressive ideology, which is basically the left wing, and which is basically where the most centrist aspect of that is the Democratic Party, as far as the two-party system goes. More concerned about progressive progressive social welfare, and whereas there's no real power in that. It's not about attaining power to achieve that. It's just about wanting to achieve that for the sake of the human condition, about sort of taking care of each other and trying to find some kind of harmonious nature within the regions of societies we have. Whereas I find a lot of what was happening post Barry Goldwater, especially into like Reaganism, was about the attainment of power just for the sake of real estate ownership and banking and money, and just sort of and a complete disregard for any aspect of social welfare, and the attainment of power was key, and it was a desire for power. Whereas I never really saw what's happening in centrist democratic policies, like we saw in 8 years of like Barack Obama. Like it never seemed like it was a matter of just trying to increase a base of power. It was just about having some kind of at least some kind of articulation or some kind of representation of some kind of civic care, and that's just completely devoid right now in sort of what you see like in sort of like the right wing administration. I mean, it's just like it's not even there's no pretense towards it at all. Whereas I think with Reagan there was a pretense towards it, like I'm taking care of you, and I think right now it's just sort of I don't ever even hear the current administration talking to its base saying like we're going to take care of you.
No.
It's just like that's gone. That started out that way. It's like you will be better off with me, and now it's just like the question is like, are you better off? Doesn't even exist. It's interesting because when I was watching some interviews with some Trump supporters after a rally just the other night on social media, and they were asking them like what they would do if their candidate doesn't win the general election in November. And they were all very astounded, like, well, that if by some chance that happens, that can't happen. We're going to be destroyed as a country. We'll be governed by liars and deceivers, and it was all this allegory that was kind of had no real base in factual information. And the one thing that they were concerned about was the ownership of guns. And so I was curious about that. It was just like, that is your main concern, is that you won't be overly taxed on your gun ownership. This was something that like the Biden ticket is all about. It's like, well, gun control. And so it's like, he's going to take away our guns. If he doesn't take away our guns, he at least is going to tax the hell out of them. and we can't stand for that. And it's like, okay, great. That's a concern. You love that gun ownership and you don't want to be taxed on it. Got it. But if I ask you, I mean, and nobody really asks this question, it's like, if you think about conscientious welfare for childhood education, if you think about the actuality of having free health care for you and your family in perpetuity, the way the UK does, the way that most of the European countries have, without this demonization of some antiquated uh, version of socialism, right? Which doesn't really exist. I mean, come on, Lenin's dead. I mean, it's like it's not. It's so. I mean that. And if you ask them like, what is socialism? They can't answer. Oh, it's a Democrats. There's actually no. They don't have the vocabulary for it. I don't either. I don't know what it is. I mean, what is it? It doesn't make sense. All it is like, it's like social welfare is what it is. It's like taking care of people. And so that idea of having conscientious funding for childhood education or having free healthcare is very perplexing. And so that question is like, why is that not a good vision to have, as opposed to like, I want my guns and I don't want the people to take them away. Why is that the most important thing? Why is it so important? And some of these people who are being interviewed said, if he loses, God forbid, because he was chosen by God, and that's another belief system, we will move to Panama. So one person says this, I'll move to Panama. And then another person, like a white couple in their 50s, rather well-fed, we'll move to Panama. Because we can own our guns there and they won't take them away.
Oh.
So, and then some kind of tattooed biker guy, I'll move to Panama. And I was just sort of like, what is this Panama thing going on? Like, and first of all, if you're going to relocate to Panama, I don't think your inherent bigotry is going to actually work in Panama. You know,
well, I don't know. There's a lot of ex-Nazis.
So that's what I was watching, and I was just like, "Is this really like the majority of the populace? Is this?" I don't think so. I really don't, because when I go outside and I interact with the population, with the world, if I do whatever traveling I do at a minimum, and through the years interacting with the world, and I find 99.9% of the people I cross paths with, whether I am intimate with them or not, are generally people who have a sense of wanting to live harmoniously, have a bit of a socially progressive kind of intellect.
Yeah.
And so I wonder, I was like, well, what is going on here? Am I just in the wrong territories? I mean, I have traveled through the deep south of the USA, and I have sort of seen the signs, and I have sort of seen some of the attitudes. I know what it is, but I don't see it as being a majority situation in the country, and so that's what leads me to be a little bit baffled.
Yeah, I think. Okay, I mean, what I'm going to say is going to lead to a question that I had for you, kind of about growing up in the 70s, but I think there's these major strands. One of them is, I think, this kind of like Reagan, Ayn Rand type, me generation type thing that has spread out over the population and kind of metastasized. I think there's that spirit there, and it's being driven by the wealthiest people who can kind of use their money and power to keep that spirit alive, even though I do think you're right. I think most of the populace doesn't want that. But I think I think they use their money to kind of like keep it in the zeitgeist in some way, in a in a vibrant way. And there's this other thing. I mean, I don't know if you felt this when you were like leaving the US and you're like, I'm done with this, but like there is a kind of exhaustion here. And I've realized that in quarantine, like last week, my wife and I started bickering a bit. And I was like, oh, you know, we get along pretty well. We have like a a whole apartment between us. Like there's a long hallway. We're not stuck in the same room all the time. And,
Right.
we have enough. We're not like trapped together exactly. So why are we started bickering? And we realized that like 6 months in, my energy is starting to be sapped by everything, and especially like the political situation, with Ruth Bader Ginsburg passing away. Like it kind of just like added this extra layer of despair, and I realized I didn't have the energy to hold back some of the negative feelings. And I think as America, as the kind of like empire is falling apart, that exhaustion is setting in, and we, as a country or as a nation, we don't have the energy to hold back like these people who like only care about there are people who are like these single issue voters who only care about like gun ownership or whatever. I think their resentment is, if they wanted to hold it back in the first place, I don't think they have the energy to hold it back anymore, and it's coming out.
Right.
And I'm curious, as a teenager in the 70s, right? I guess some of your like formative years are during the Nixon administration. Yeah. And I'm kind of curious as to like, if were you paying attention? Did you feel, what did it feel like living in that time or being a teenager in that time?
Certainly, I mean, my awareness of Nixon being deceitful was heightened, certainly by Watergate. I was a little too young to sort of have too much articulation with this. I grew up in at a time in the early 70s where there was always this anxiety by the time you reach 18 that you were subjected to being drafted into military service. And because the draft was still a thing in the early 70s. And so there was always this idea of like, well, what do you do? I mean, it's like, you act like you're crazy, you take lots of drugs before you go to the internment. Do you just say you're gay, and all these things were just sort of like these strategies, and I was like, well, I'll do all of them. I'll take lots of drugs. And I will be gay, and I will I'll be I just no fucking way I'm gonna go into the military career. Sorry, I'm using the F word, and there's some young people in the room. So Nixon for me was just like I knew that sort of like the older youth generation that was coming out of the 60s was their focus was so much about wanting to sort of end the Vietnam War, and the Vietnam War, which was which was like this albatross of just like of demonic proportions happening in the culture at a time when this culture was like bringing in all this sort of Eastern philosophical ideology into this this separation of expectations of being into like the fabric of just like the standards of society, being a banker or being like a doctor or being this or that. It's like, well, you can actually be a free spirit. It's like, how's that for an alternative? And you could be a poet, and you could be a musician. You can just like live off the land and live in communities that sort of get away from the grid, and that's your alternative. And so that was this incredible thing of just like embracing this kind of philosophy of that people like Allen Ginsberg had brought from India, like in the early 60s, and was bringing it to his work. And you heard Bob Dylan extolling it, and you heard the Beatles were extolling it, for God's sakes. So it's like there's such a powerful youth movement that we definitely know about, at odds with this completely belligerent and devious war that was happening in Vietnam, where the same age group was being sent to and put into this situation of just like killing and dying. And so I remember that explicitly in my youth, and sort of seeing that disparity in that culture that was a bit older than I was, and how extreme it was, and knowing that it was like, it's all the underground journalism that was rampant was all about that. and it was all about Nixon as like this kind of like manifestation of a pig, and like in Goldwater, and then and the police as a state of just like force of oppression. But at the same time, in retrospect, it's interesting because there was also all this kind of misogyny that was happening in even that hippie culture. There's a lot of weird kind of racist stereotyping that was happening in the hippie culture as well, because they were still children coming out of like the 50s, late 50s into the
Yeah.
60s and the 70s. I was born in 58, so I was 10 in 68, and so that's what my experience was. And to see how hippie had leavened off into sort of the Carpenters, like in the early 70s, seeing the Carpenters on Ed Sullivan as a a, a, a young couple playing rock music that was actually kind of acceptable to to the majority of the United States, exhausted by the Vietnam War, which was a misnomer because it wasn't the Vietnam War; it was the American War in Vietnam. And that was another issue at hand, to sort of like to use linguistics to sort of change the nature of that war. It's like Vietnam. It was not a Vietnam War. It was an American war in Vietnam. It was us, and so it's still to this day one of the most despicable situations that the United States was ever involved with. Almost as despicable as the situation we're dealing now with, like this clown sort of like empowering this what you were just talking about earlier. I wanted to get back to that because that's sort of what it leads to. But I sort of, when the Carpenters came on TV, and it was just there was this exhaustion from the '60s that happened, and it was like, now let's just sort of like forget everything and just drown in the beautiful voice of Karen Carpenter, which was again had its own sort of underlying significance because it was like this young woman sort of like terrorized by her own image, as a young woman in America through how young women were being portrayed, and it was a curious time. And so I come of age when punk rock starts happening, and it's sort of like kicking against sort of the complacency and the fallout of hippie, And so hippie is kind of like these bad guys, and you can make fun of hippies, and it's like, well, we're not hippie. So you cut all your hair off, and you're decidedly anti-hippie. And the only other sort of zeitgeist thing that's happening is disco, which is actually very kind of extremely popular. It's all about being popular, and punk rock is about being unpopular. It's just like popularity is uncool, money is uncool, wealth is uncool, and so you kind of embrace poverty, and that's your glory. And disco is just the opposite. And so there was like this kind of anti-disco sentiment in punk rock, which I was part and parcel to. But in retrospect, I see how disco and punk were just two bedfellows, and disco is so as important and significant as punk rock was, even now, and it still continues to inform the same way that punk culture informs, only because it was a music that came out of community. It came out of like African American community, not only African American community, but it came out of like gay community, and it was a voice for these two like communities that sort of, in a sense, African Americanism and homosexuality were kind of there's conflict there, but it was like appeased through disco, and that to me is like the primary success of that music, the aspect of that music. And so and the punk rock was like this voice of just sort of just disparity with complacency and disparity with expectation, as well as the way hippie was at one time. Certainly punk became the new hippie, but it incorporated hippie anyway. It's interesting because when Reagan does become elected in 80, after Carter, Carter, and it was interesting when Carter came in because, I mean, the first thing Jimmy Carter does is he resolves any illegality by by war resistors, Vietnam War resistors. He's like everybody's free. You're not going to go to jail for being a war resistor. That was big. Um, Reaganism was really interesting coming in '80, and it was really interesting seeing the reaction from um, from youth culture at that time, because youth culture at that time was pretty pretty hard to identify. Punk culture was a bit of an art school thing for the most part. You sort of had the art school Talking Heads world, and and Malcolm McLaren, and it was also this kind of incorporating this kind of street language of street rock, like coming out of like the New York Dolls, but it was still always this kind of there was always this intellectual undercurrent to punk rock. But when Reagan came in, a lot of that music had become somewhat mainstreamized, and the hardcore bands that sort of happened in '80, like Minor Threat coming out of DC, and all the bands coming out of the Discord scene, and then the bands coming out of the Los Angeles scene, which is really sort of the primary scene in a big way, in San Francisco. But those were the cities. What was so interesting was all these hardcore bands that were coming out of the suburbs and coming out of the smaller areas of the United States, and a lot of the shared language was kicking against what Reagan represented, and this idea of attaining wealth in disservice to the actual necessities of the working class, and for young hardcore kids to sort of talk about that, and to be somewhat kind of politicized by literature that they were creating on their own, and sort of or coming out of political thinkers like Tim Yohannan at Maximum Rock and Roll. This was really important, and they were spreading political tracts that were sophisticated political tracts in their fanzines. But at the same time, and that was incredible. That was incredible, and so that's to me is something that's interesting now. Is like, where is that now? Like, where is that voice now? You talk about like this sort of exhaustion from 4 years of this return to the most base aspects of Reagan Bush, right? It's sort of like, okay, we're going to just completely depoliticize Reagan Bush and get down to this point of just running roughshod over the entire social welfare of the country, and just sort of bank. And we're just going to bank on it. And we're just going to feather on us, and we're going to, it's all about complete control of the Middle East. It's looking, it's just like looking at this future vision of where, only those who attain power will rule and survive. So it's totalitarianism at its most just like obvious, and it's, as we know, it's the encroachment of fascism, and where are these voices of resistance and resilience in any which way we can look at? Are they only online? Are they really out? But
I think so. Well, there's people out. So I mean, there's like
people out
protests
on the
happening
streets
in every city almost every night. And they just like after a week or so, the media stopped covering it. But this is, I think, interesting. And I'm sure it's happening somewhere that I'm just too old to be keyed into it. But like my earliest political awakening happened because of, I was thinking back to this. I'm like, Sonic Youth. I found Sonic Youth and hardcore at the same time. I mean, hardcore happened when I was like a child, but like I found Black Flag and Minor Threat and Sonic Youth all around the same time. Like Youth Against Fascism. I mean, there was so like all the the political, the kind of like overt political ideology that is in a lot of the music that I encountered as a child. It gave me an awareness. It didn't give me a kind of political ideology really, but it gave me an awareness that was already attached to a morality that I had from my parents and from Judaism that was about, doing the right thing and being good to people and finding justice where you can and helping. And then that those kind of strands in my life bloomed in, by the time I get to college and the time, I start reading Chomsky and Zinn and all these people. But like, it starts in the music. It started in the music I listened to as a teenager. And I think I think having politically minded musicians that are making good art, that are not just like making, like, it's not just a political statement, but that you are making good art that happens to be political, or maybe good art that is infused. Maybe that's part of it that makes it that good. But like, whatever the reason, having that as a teenager is really important, because that's the thing that primes you for understanding these things when you can actually grasp them as an adult, or as a early 20 something or whatever.
It took me the longest time to actually realize that making art, being a musician, putting a record out, putting a cassette out, putting a CD out, being a visual artist and having a show, showing your paintings, being a filmmaker, making a movie, getting it out there in distribution, is inherently a political act. And because, I mean, it's an engagement, it's a social engagement. There's an exchange. It can be free, or it can be through monetary. I also was, we talk about punk rock and hardcore, and to me it was like it's so much in tandem with hip hop. And for us, when Sonic Youth was working at the same time as Public Enemy in a studio in 1989, 88, 89 in New York City, and seeing how a group like Public Enemy was working, where it was all about giving voice to social engagement and to information, and to the dissemination of information for the welfare of their intimate culture. And I remember talking to them about that. I remember in having conversations about that, and it stayed with me. But I never really thought about. I thought about what Public Enemy was doing as far as issuing records, and what a lot of hip hop was always a political situation, because it was a voice of a faction of society that was completely disenfranchised and marginalized, and I didn't feel like I had that intimacy in my culture, and I felt like my resistance was just based on sort of being at odds with what the right wing agenda was, and so I didn't think that was even political. I just thought that was just sort of being sensible, and so. But it wasn't really until I saw a lecture by Amiri Baraka, who's no longer with us, and who used to write under the name Leroy Jones, and he gave a lecture that kind of bothered me, because he was saying, like, if you're going to write poetry, it was a poetry lecture when I was teaching at Naropa University, the writing workshop there, and so he was a guest speaker, and I had seen him talk before, and I've always had nothing but love for Mary Baraka, but he could be kind of infuriating with some of the things he would say. And but I think, well, anybody's free to say whatever they want to say. And he said something at this lecture where he was saying, like, if you're going to write poetry, if you're going to be an artist, it has to be socially engaged. It has to be for the welfare of the society that you're sort of working within. Otherwise, it's just la-di-da. It's just like, love poetry. And I was just like, well, wait a minute. If I want to work in literature and I just really want to sort of get involved with the essence of language and talk about linguistics and write abstract, concrete poetry that just sort of deals with just the artfulness of linguistics and language and the words on the page and that kind of architecture, and it's like that, there's some kind of there's some edification there that I like, and it's just like, why should I disregard that because it's not socially engaged? Mm-hmm. It's like, but then I realized, well, the actual act of sort of presenting work, publishing, putting something out there in any which way, it's from ground zero. It's political. It's like, it's because you are socially engaged. So it may be come to terms with him as making a statement like that, and then just thinking about, I mean, this year especially, just thinking about communication in general and how we have this crisis situation that we've shared globally, where we all sort of like are in a place of isolation with each other. And the one thing that immediately started happening is like this ramp up of communication through technology. People doing concerts on Zoom and all this kind of let's get this happening. You know, people talking on like the way we were talking. And it's just like I just sort of thought about like, I mean, that's the reason I called my record "By the Fire," because I just thought about like, okay, this is our campfire that we're all sort of talking around, right? You know, or like the Native American passing the talking stick around the fire kind of thing. And I just sort of thought about that, and that was kind of it just sort of led me into thinking of like how sort of creative endeavors aren't vanquished by oppression, even though the oppression is through like this situation we have through a virus that keeps us away from each other.
Yeah. It just makes it tougher. That's what I think. I think that like it just makes like the energy, the creative energy I have. Like I've had a bunch of projects that I've been working on, and I think a lot about energy and entropy, and I think a lot of stuff comes down to that, where whatever your physical, like the biology that you are born with, your cells create some amount of energy, right? And you can have like caffeine and some other stuff to boost that, obviously, but like your chemistry is your chemistry, your biology is your biology, and that combined with like the circumstances of your life only give you so much energy for the day. And if I have to, take the dog out and wash the dishes and cook dinner, and then I have to write a script or whatever, right? Yeah. How much energy, after I've done all that stuff, how much energy do I have? And then again, the like kind of oppressiveness, right, of the situation we're in takes more energy out of it. So like all the creativity is still there. It's just has less energy going to it, or it has more stuff it has to like push through to get to the surface.
Yeah. There's a lot of psychic conflict going on right now, obviously.
Yeah.
And how do you, I mean, there's strategies of dealing with it. I mean, for me, sometimes if I get overwhelmed by all of this, to the point, I mean, because, just being a musician, even a musician of like whatever stature I have as a musician through my history, it's still like I have to work. And it's like my work is basically going out and touring and traveling, because that's the only revenue.
Right. I mean,
record sales are not revenue unless you're kind of super upper echelon selling billions of records. Most musicians don't do this. They don't have that privilege. They don't have that in their world. And Bandcamp is like, maybe buys you a donut each week. But, so it's like, I mean, just seriously, that's just how it is. And so touring is essential, for a lot of people like myself. So that's been pulled away. So it's just like that. So you obviously also have this where your whatever revenue you have toward the responsibilities of your daily life is really dissipated.
Mm-hmm.
I think about strategies, and then I think about like, sometimes I find myself falling into like some kind of Zen place of just like, just stop. And just like, what really matters? Does it really matter that you have to do this or that, and for creative measure, you have to sort of produce this or that? I guess maybe walking the dog it could be the most essential thing of your day, because basically what you're doing is like, you're giving that dog that dog doesn't have the logic to understand like what's going on in the world that humans have been sort of dealing with, and he never will, or she never will. If your dog is a they, I don't know, but it's like that to me is like, yeah. I mean, it's like sometimes I go to these places where like, that is the most essential thing. I refuse to be overwhelmed by anything else, It's just like, I'm just going to walk the dog. And it's
Yeah.
like, and why shouldn't that be? You talk about Ruth Bader Ginsburg dying. I was like, yeah, I mean, it's like the amount of good work somebody like it has done in our culture, and to like to leave this realm. It's like, you think about it. It's just like, well, she's not going to be around to sort of see what happens November 2nd. Like, I mean, you'd think you would want to sort of see that, like all these to come to this point where your country is dealing with such a situation that it's never dealt with before, right? It's been sort of hijacked, right? I mean, there's been situations where high office has been manipulated in its control, but never has it been so just hijacked.
I mean,
and
it didn't even feel like this I mean, again, I know you were like, when Watergate happened, you were about 14 or so.
Yeah.
Like, it didn't even feel.
Oh, no. I didn't feel that. No, I felt no threat from a situation going so out of control that it couldn't be rectified. I think that's a little different right now. It feels like it has the potential to go completely off the rails.
Yeah, totally. It feels chaotic. And I mean, in a way that it never, like in your lifetime, it never felt like the wheels were coming off of the car before.
Not when there's so much toxicity happening in the crisis of climate consciousness, where we're seeing such, where we're seeing where we're seeing just plant life burn up because it doesn't have enough enough moisture in it. And
yeah, there's fire tornadoes.
There's fire tornado. I mean, all this. So this is going to happen, and this is happening, and we see it happening, and we know why it's happening. Science tells us why this is happening. Science tells us there's ways of abetting this if we really sort of get down to it and actually sort of look at it seriously and start funding the measures that sort of can abet it. We could do a lot of replanting, a lot of regrowth. We can do a lot of this. This has to happen. So that's new. And, there was a bit of an ecology movement when I was growing up too,
right.
But that was sort of like, yeah, whatever. I mean, we're gonna live. We'll live. But now it's like, well, will we live? I mean, it's like the health of the planet will become the most primary concern. It'll overshadow any of our social crises, because we won't be able to live or breathe. And it's like, well, fuck everything else. I mean, it's like, if you're going to start killing off our sustenance, which is air and water and growth, it's like, that's a whole nother ball game. That's never existed before. And the fact that it's coexisting with a denial, like a denial that is like, the great representation of one of the largest land masses on the earth, where it's like those who represent it are in denial of it, and encouraging in denial and enabling. Yep.
Again, I think it's all these strands, all these strands it's like one of those, like if you see a sine wave of a bunch of different sound waves, and the crests, it just happens. All the crests are hitting at the same time, or whatever, right? They're all
it's like the worst black metal recording of all time. Like looking at that bandwidth. It's like, oh, there it is. Those guys were onto something, weren't they? I
mean, when you were okay, so you're in Bethel, Connecticut, right? As a teenager, you moved from Florida at what, age 9 or something like that?
Yeah.
How is this stuff getting to you, right? This is pre-internet. I also grew up pre-internet mostly, and you for me, you had to find this stuff out by accident, right? If there was a band you liked, you went and got a CD of theirs, and maybe you got also a compilation they were on, and that's how you discovered other bands, right? And then, I'll say this, Lollapalooza 95 was this kind of a singularity of music for me, where I'm like, I go for Sonic Youth and Pavement, and then I find all these other bands from there.
Right.
And it's kind of like,
Yeah.
it's stuff like that. What's happening for you? And like, how do you, like, both politically and musically, like, is your family, are they playing a lot of music around the house? Like, how are you getting this stuff? And Bethel is like, what, a pretty small town, right? In Connecticut?
Yeah. It's like a bedroom community of New York, Um, I think my curiosity was piqued. I mean, I have a brother who's 5 years older than I is, and his community of friends were bringing Louie into the house, and these kind of early rock and roll records, and hearing the Beatles through him and all this kind of stuff. I was certainly attracted to it. I was attracted to it because my older brother had a transistor radio, and I was hearing these sounds. The culture was permeated with rock and roll anyway. It was in the news, and it was. But I think youth culture in the 60s took it upon itself to sort of issue its own literature. So, I mean, underground journalism was rampant in the 60s. I mean, it's for me, it's like it's some of the most fascinating times of writing is like going to bookseller websites that deal with like, runs of old copies of the Oracle or the Berkeley Barb or even like old Village Voices or whatever. It's fantastic, but it was every town, every college town across the country had underground newspapers being churned out, and so they were everywhere, and they were next to the underground comics, and so you saw this kind of lascivious kind of depravity of humor, and it's like what the it's like so you learned about sex through Robert Crumb. I mean, it's
right.
Just like, so it's like how do you even deal with that? It's just like or like the men's magazines were that were hidden, and so those were so kind of exotic, and to actually locate something like that was just like crazy. And I think about young people now who are that age now, people 12, 13 years old, and being able to like tap into like extreme pornography. It's like that did not exist in my upbringing. So
Nope.
so what is that difference, of information, of just like having that information of pornography?
Although if
I
you
don't
have
know.
R. Crumb and like Fritz the Cat or whatever, it's like,
Compared to like, you porn or me porn or whatever the fuck it is, that is like it's a completely, no pun intended, different ball game. But it's like I wonder. It's like I think the human condition is able to sort of process on levels that are I don't underestimate. So if we had that kind of hardcore information at that age, would we I know it would have whatever effect it has. But I mean, entertainment information is extremely more violent than it ever was when I was growing up. I mean, violence to us was watching combat on TV or something like that, or even like learning about like. I remember when the Manson murders first happened and seeing that as a news report and thinking about how odd that was. That hippies killed people or something, or that there was some kind of and then the fact that they were kind of had this whole theater afterwards of just like putting X's on their foreheads and crawling around and chanting, and it was just like it was just confounding, but it seemed like it was really it was just in its own little territory or something. It didn't seem so widespread. Pornography is just completely widespread to the culture now. I mean, it's just everybody can tap into it, no matter how old you are, who you are, whatever. It's available, and you can't. It can barely be hidden by parental forces. That's curious. In a way, it's like, well, I mean, there's a bit of a liberation here, right? I mean, it's just like we can, I would think like young people process really quickly, and they're just like, oh, well, there's that, and it's like, well, do you process in a way like, let's not confuse that with reality, because that's not reality. I mean, that's some hyper-powered kind of like fantastical thing geared towards one thing. It's geared towards like this kind of like masturbation or something. It's like, but that's not reality. That's just like it's not love. That's not like true sort of sexual behavior. But I think some people try to implement that in their lives, and they realize like, well, that's impossible. That's like jumping off a building and flying, right? You can't really do that. Superman can do that. So it's like, I mean, I think, but I again, I don't underestimate the intelligence of youth either. I think young people see what is actual and what's not, and if they don't, then they have no community. I think there's a education in childhood communities where children can look at each other and go like, no, that's this is I can only hope that's the case, but I don't really I don't see like I don't see this super sort of demoralized kind of social world coming up out of this liberation online.
Yeah.
I don't.
No.
I mean, I see, the only thing I see that's like problematic is seeing like that kid walking around, with a rifle, sort of popping people off.
Yes.
And getting it and getting a free pass for it, from the leader in charge of America. That to me is like that's pornography.
Yeah,
that to me is utter porn.
It's true. Yes, I mean, it's getting. We're reaching some kind of crisis moment here. But like when you back in Bethel, like I mean, two things. Did you have that community? And did you grow up? I know your dad was a professor, right?
Yeah.
Did you grow up in a kind of like rational? Like, were you approaching these things from a very like rational? I grew up in a kind of like very rational household. We had like we felt our emotions, but we never really like analyzed them. There was no analysis of it. It wasn't repressed. I don't like really think that we were like we weren't robots, but I think rationality was the primary way of like interacting in some way and logic in some way. And I'm curious about like those two things. So did you have community, and like was that what was the household like when you were growing up?
Yeah, it was I knew that our household was quite different than other households I would visit because we actually had books and we had art on the walls.
Yeah.
And I was a little surprised sometimes visiting other kids' houses where that didn't exist so much. My father would have different people coming over from university, and these discussions would happen. So there was that kind of language was in the house. So yeah, no, there was like this. There was a bit of an intellectual, and there was definitely a rational thing, and it was a faith-based household. My mother brought us up as nice little Catholic kids who went to Catholic school, until high school. I kind of I chose not to go to a Catholic high school. My father was not faith-based at all growing up, but his interest in philosophy brought him into Christian ideology and Catholicism, and so he started getting really involved with that. And which was kind of amusing to us kids because we were kind of really growing out of that and sort of seeing our father, who was never into that, all of a sudden becoming devout. It was just kind of funny. But so that was always there too, and that sort of stuck with me, certainly. Like even like becoming a musician in Sonic Youth and writing songs that sort of dealt with my own sort of feelings about the kind of idea of servitude and sort of principles of religious ideology, and thinking about that, and knowing that they're realizing my own sort of conflicts with such a thing, and sort of trying to get to the more sort of more interesting metaphysical aspects of it. It's like,
right.
What is that? It's right. So that's certainly something I would find in my investigations into all of religious kind of study and ideology, be it Catholicism or Judaica or Eastern Buddhist practice, and without becoming a card member of anything, right? Sort of having sort of this kind of open dialogue. Oh, thank you. Thanks so much.
It's dinner time.
Oh, Are we going to close up shop?
Yeah, let's.
To be very rude, no, just because there's only because I say that only because it's 8 o'clock here.
Do you mind if I ask one more question?
Yes, of course. One more question. I love talking to you, though. This has really been wonderful. This has been a really nice conversation. So
this is great, and I think again, I like asking these questions because I think it gets more at the heart of the things you make than it does if I was like, I mean, I do have, I am curious a little bit. Like there's some musicians where like I hear a song and I'm like, I had Mac McCon from Superchunk on a couple months ago, and he sent me some of his demos from when he was in high school. And I could hear his nascent guitar playing in that. It's like when I hear your style, there is something that I know it's your style, and I know there is something in you. I'm kind of curious about like, but like going along with this kind of like these intellectual and also kind of like religious strands that are in your household. How do you think those two things play like connected in you? Because you have these two, again, not just before your dad when you said like he was like philosophically interested, I thought, oh, he started like kind of like reading about like the dogma of Catholicism, but like you mean he like actually like kind of like grew faith in some way from.
He was he didn't really become like devout in that way. He got devout into just sort of the texts. He was really into like, starting to read St. Thomas Aquinas and Thomas Merton and these kind of things, and having conversations with priests, like debates sometimes.
Okay.
So no, he wasn't getting into like kneeling at his bed and having night prayers before going to. He didn't get into the sort of the more superstitious kind of. Rote kind of rituals of like that wasn't happening. So but then for me, but I there's sometimes the iconography and the imagery and just sort of the of the history of a lot of sort of religious pictorialization, I find to be still something I really like to sort of investigate and look at and think about like. The qualities and the values of it, and I always remember visiting paintings by the old masters in these Renaissance paintings in these old Italian churches as I was touring through Italy, and the guy who was touring with us, who was our Italian interpreter and young punk rock van driver. I said, "Come on, let's go look at these paintings." He's like, "I don't want to go in there," and so I took him into this church and I was showing him these wonderful Tintoretto paintings, and he just looked around this old Italian church, Italy, like this Roman Catholic like hotbed of just like, and he just looked around this Italian punk rock and he's like, "I hate this shit." And I was like, "Oh my God, get out of here! You can't say that in here." But then at the same time, I kind of laughed at like you laughed because I was like, it doesn't really matter, does it? It's like he was just like completely over it, and he was unafraid of it, and he had been subjected to this oppression of like how to be and through like religious morality and like and he was like, fuck it, I'm a punk rocker. And like fuck religion and fuck Catholics and fuck all this. And I was like, look, go beyond that. Look at the work and see what this was their fanzine. That right there. That was the fanzine of the 1400s and So for me it's just like, to me it's ongoing. I don't know. I've never come to any grand conclusions in my life or my work, and I don't expect to, and I just like so all I want to do is just like at least get past November 2nd, hopefully with some kind of like some kind of measure of dignity for most people living in this world, particularly in the USA.
So it's more like your father's intellectual strands are more of what patterned your brain than like say
yeah, definitely.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thurston, thank you so much for doing this.
You're more than welcome. And it was really wonderful.
Yeah, it was a real joy to get to talk to you.
Maybe we can do it again sometime. You're in LA, so like next time we're there.
Would love to. Absolutely.
We'll rock it out. Okay.
All right. Well, thanks,
Cool,
and
man.
have a good dinner. And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye, oh bye, oh bye, oh bye.